customs like half an hour ago. So I was telling Tom this is going to be like Tony Robbins mixed with Oprah, crazy speed, frenetic energy. But yes, welcome to Parallel Worlds, the mysterious art of the sub-narrative. I'll start with who am I? I am Navid Khavari. I'm a senior writer at Ubisoft. And I'll give you the usual list of awkward stuff slide. I think it's like, I always get really weird around these slides, but I'll just run it through it really quickly. I started in interactive comics with a TV show called Lost Girl. Then I went on to a bunch of nightmare projects I'm not going to name. And then today I find myself at Ubisoft Toronto, technically, and I'm on loan to Ubisoft Massive. At Ubisoft for about 5 years, I've kind of helped develop narratives for the likes of Splinter Cell Blacklist, Far Cry 4, Assassin's Creed Unity, and now The Division. And for random's sake, I also moonlight on radio, telling small, horrifyingly embarrassing stories about my childhood for a CBC radio show in Canada called Definitely Not the Opera. So the last few years have been particularly interesting because instead of focusing on a main campaign narrative, as I've done with Splinter Cell with the likes of Richard Dansky, who might be in this room, I hope. I see him. There he is with his Yeti. I found myself developing sub-narratives for two IPs whose needs couldn't be more different, Far Cry 4 and Assassin's Creed Unity. Now, it's no surprise that sub-narratives often remain underdeveloped in games, and while it wasn't really clear to me at first, I'd soon realized they are uniquely suited to our medium. Games are immersive, they're experiential, and they're alternating between multiple worlds is par for the course. So to start, I'm going to talk a bit about Assassin's Creed and the murder mysteries I developed alongside Russell Lees, who's a narrative designer in Ubisoft Montreal. And I want to start there because they kind of offer a picture of what traditional sub-narratives usually are. And here we go. I'd say it's probably safe to say that you all kind of know the deal with Assassin's Creed. So I'm going to kind of jump to the premise of the murder mysteries right away. As the hero Arno, the player gets to explore a Paris in the throes of the French Revolution. It was all built with an unbelievably high attention to detail. But once you're off the main path and you're kind of bouncing around the city, you might stumble upon a murder that needs solving. Sometimes these were high-profile murders, and others were kind of inventions that we did for the sake of diversity. So the player, he'll get to play true detective and solve the murder by inspecting the crime scene, analyzing clues that he keeps in case files, you take witness statements, and you corroborate all the evidence to pick a suspect. The goal here with the murder mysteries, and honestly of all the side missions for Assassin's Creed, was to create kind of a living, breathing Paris. 1,000 stories, we called it, for the players to explore. But with the mysteries, while I knew we would be able to inject some character and personality in the suspects and evidence, Arno's voice would largely remain constrained to kind of the evidence notes. So from the get-go, it was clear that the story was to be born from the mechanics, the settings, and what I call witness hooks. So where to start? Because this was kind of a brand new type of quest for Assassin's Creed. It was too risky to kind of wait until all the new systems were in the build and kind of test these mysteries on players. So UB Montreal actually developed early prototypes with a brilliant idea. We whiteboarded the mysteries out with people from the office, writing out clues by hand, acting out the witnesses, and you'd see how quickly they'd solve it. You'd determine the difficulty that way, and you'd revise and revise and revise and just whiteboard again. Now, even without next-gen horsepower and fanciness, it worked, basically because, we as a species, we inherently want to solve problems. That's just the way we are. And the murder mysteries themselves took advantage of this with a very simple core mechanic. And it was accuse the evildoers, to accuse with consequences. And this mechanic took the mysteries from a passive to kind of an active input. And after gathering all the clues and speaking to witnesses, players would need to deduce who the murderer was and accuse them. So if you were right, you'd get a reward, and if you were wrong, you'd be penalized. This meant witness testimony when written, needed to be turned to cover three basic areas. There'd be kind of the red herrings to lead the player astray. You would have white noise chatter that would kind of muddy up the evidence. And the critical intel that would add up to the murderer. Being able to accuse citizens after hearing their tales kind of sucks the player in. And it was a bit inspiring in its simplicity. But that was one layer. For the mysteries to form kind of a cohesive narrative loop, they needed the last element, which was simple, short story hooks. Now, weirdly enough, it was telling those same embarrassing childhood stories I mentioned earlier on the radio that kind of taught me to keep focused on the elusive, simple hook. These CBC stories would rely on a basic narrative through line that are designed to last at most 6 minutes. So there was no room for fat, and if I did a pitch, it had better have a clear hook, or I shouldn't even bother. The stories, they would range from using cancer as an escape, or having my, and this is true, my rap career end due to a panic attack during a small town recital. That is all real, and there's video evidence. I was also 8. Looking inward for these stories actually helped me develop kind of short windows that were sort of a training ground to get in and out of story before I'd overstayed my welcome. So here's some basic examples of that. You know, we can look at the murder of Jean-Paul Marat, who was a revolutionary. He was killed in his bathtub. Now, historically, the murderer, Charlotte Corday, had confessed immediately, and that did not work so well for us because she confessed. So we used it to our advantage. So we thought, what if you had multiple confessions from those who wanted to be known as the killer of Marat, and then the player has to find truth in the noise? You can use the same method with the death of Philibert Asper, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, who historically died after being lost in the Paris catacombs. No one knew how this guy died, or even if he was real. So we linked his death to a pack of murderous nuns protecting their precious chartreuse from his thieving hands. I was completely laughed at when I suggested murderous nuns, but it was totally a hook, and it honestly did not seem so strange, and I promise you it's not very strange when you play the game. The key was none of these were treated as throwaways. I didn't want to settle for a kind of bland proposition for the player. Each clue and each murder was treated with the same care as a main campaign. And to go even further, we'd write them as if each suspect was kind of the hero of their own story. Even if they got a single line of dialogue, we'd make it count. Most importantly, though, we needed to allow Arno to take a step back from the narrative and allow Paris to step up as a compelling character. You can call it world-building sub-narrative. It sounds simple, but as always, simple is deceptively difficult. It covers so many bases for side missions out there. You can look at Arkham with the ZAS phone calls. You can look at Mass Effect, Watch Dogs. They all use the same method. And by putting so much time and effort into fleshing out the world of the murder mysteries, we were able to give players something a little different. Missions where your goal wasn't to use your assassin skills to kill people, but rather to solve an intellectual riddle, something that hadn't been done in Assassin's Creed before. Now, this all worked perfectly fine and dandy for ACU, as it has such a richly detailed and powerful history. Jumping ahead. It has such a richly detailed and powerful history thanks to writers like Corey May, Jill Murray, Darby McDevitt. These are people who crafted memorable stories, and I'd call it kind of the AC advantage. And what I mean by that is players usually have some kind of cursory knowledge of the Assassin's Order when they start. Having the player meddle in historical events was not completely out of the ordinary in the player's mind. Not much context was needed. As such, the side missions naturally geared to self-contained individual stories, as most do. But there's more than a few ways to structure a sub-narrative. And now I want to contrast that with an alternate method, and this is where we enter the world of Far Cry. Our studio at Ubisoft Toronto was tasked with creating a literal parallel world, a Shangri-La paradise that would act to the main campaign. Now with Far Cry, it's a new story, a new journey each time out. It's without canon. And that's a big thing everyone loves about it. But that also brings a whole unique set of challenges each time out. There's no Assassin's Order, there's no Abstergo, and no Voss Insanity touchstone for us to rely on. The number after the name is completely arbitrary. It's an experiment each time out. And this was a particularly challenging experiment because each mission wraps itself neatly. But Shangri-La was to have its own arc, its own journey. It was a parallel world in the truest sense. So the question I'm going to pretend you're asking is this: where did that desire come from? Well, Far Cry 3 was a surprise success in many ways, and one of those surprises was the popularity of the drug sequences, those dream sequences interspersed throughout the game. It reinforced how games can make these kinds of sequences immensely and incredibly real. This is an image from Kotaku, who proclaimed, "I'll have whatever drugs Far Cry 3 are having." And I'm sure they did. We can follow that with DLC, then I'm sure you all recognize this image, that took an entire generation of 80s references and crammed it into a 4-hour experience. And the seeds for a parallel world in a full Far Cry game were really planted after that. And what was going to be the differentiator here, though? We needed to be different. If it was a full game, Far Cry had already established it could handle sub-narrative well and at a high quality. But how could we build upon this? So basically, that's Shangri-La. We would be asked to create a sub-narrative, this parallel world, that would be an optional journey, and that's the big word, optional. It was one that'd be compelling enough for the player to explore and would feed into the main campaign without breaking it. This journey would have its own progression and provide meaning for the main character and to the player. Perhaps most importantly, unlike Far Cry 3's dream sequences, we were adding new gameplay. So this was an ancient world. There'd be no guns, there'd be no bombs, just a knife and a bow and arrow with mystical upgrades. Now, when I began on the project, all we really knew for certain was the gateway to Shangri-La, and that was called the Tanka. Kyrat was loosely based on Nepal and Tibet, and there you'd find there were these ancient, beautifully painted tapestries telling the stories of gods. You know, you can think ancient kind of graphic novels that were meant to be meditated upon to apply as learnings for your life. In Far Cry, the main character, AJ Gale, I'm still not sure which one it is, would find a tanka ripped into 5 pieces, and they would each represent a mission. These would be scattered throughout the world, and when he picks them up, he's mentally transported to Shangri-La. Thousands of years in Kyrat's past, and he would inhabit the body of this ancient warrior. That's all I knew when I started, and I knew that, and for some unknown reason, he had a companion tiger, and this tiger would give AJ advice, kind of like Oprah, as I mentioned before, and I had no idea what to do with him. So, the beginnings of the story weren't really materializing with that info. But then kind of came the gut punches. I'm not even getting started. We'd have to create a story with one sole human character, the Shangri-La hero, and he could not interact with any other member of his own species. Even if they had existed, he would be mute, as the player character was locked to AJ's voice in the main game. So on top of that, there were scripted sequences. However, there were no scripted sequences planned initially. So basically, that just led to this face. And I just needed a reason to put that in there. Now, often the toughest part of coming into developing a sub-narrative or any kind of optional content is to eliminate the prejudice we as developers might bring to it. And I honestly have to give credit to our team as a whole, because not once was there ever a choice made that kind of reflected this was throwaway content. I think the video sort of speaks for itself, but this was, right from the beginning, intended to be kind of all killer, no filler. And step 2 was establishing a healthy co-dev relationship. Now, once UB Montreal saw the kind of results and passion that we had, they really honestly let us take the reins on Shangri-La. I have no juicy horror stories or anything like that. It was a wonderful relationship. And in a weird way, the co-dev relationship helped us focus on Shangri-La as a parallel universe, one with its own rules and its own structure. It was a very clean break, so much so that when it came to writing these lost lieutenants letters that you'd find in the game world, I took on the role of the lieutenant who was tripping out on this Shangri-La business, and I would write to Liz Albee, who was a writer in Ubisoft Montreal, who played kind of my horrified wife. And then we swapped roles. So we wrote back and forth in character, and it completely fit that kind of co-dev divide. Now the key here was keeping the lines of communication open and honest, so we were still working on the same game. We hammered away at it with one eye on Karat and the other eye trained squarely on Shangri-La. And we quickly realized creatively our parallel game world was both a blessing and a curse. We'd been asked to design paradise, and who the hell knows what paradise is? I'm not talking about tripping in your parents' backyard or anything like that. I mean, we really had no idea what's your starting point. So that was the moment when, for the story, I kind of dawned on an inspiration that kind of came from an unexpected place. Embracing limits is something that I always admired about a band like the White Stripes. They taught me limits are your friend. They are good and they are healthy. Here's a band that purposefully said red, white, black, drums and a guitar, and that's it. And then they pushed each individual element as far as it could go, and then had them all work together in harmony. By doing this, your weaknesses don't show. And well, they honestly created some of the best music we've seen in a long time. So to make meaning out of this, we needed to keep it simple. Story-wise, meta-narrative, and endless side quests can make the through line become very unclear. And to avoid that, I realized I'd have to make even further cuts to my narrative tools. We chucked the talking tiger kind of Mufasa stuff. So now we had a companion that did not speak to a non-speaking player character. But the thing was, Paradise really needed to feel real. It needed to let us focus on grounding the world in a heightened kind of reality. And I'm just going to grab a drink here. Now, I also looked at Buddhist and Hindu traditions as inspiration. But to keep the simple through line, I really focused on the journey of the main character. And Far Cry 4, it was the story of AJ Gale, a 20-something troubled young man who goes to his home country of Karat to fulfill his mother's last dying wishes, to spread her ashes from a temple in the mountains. He finds his homeland is torn apart by a tyrant, which is Pagan Min, who is battling this rebel group called the Golden Path. AJ joins that fight alongside fellow rebels Amita and Sabal, and they try to take down Min. Immediately, these questions and themes popped. You know, what defines your homeland and who you are? Where does duty or obligation end and moral responsibility begin? And who can AJ look to for inspiration in his journey? So I grabbed a mirror to the main character, and what I saw was an ancient warrior named Kalanag and a winged demon we call the Rakshasa. In our parallel world, Kalanag was sent to find Shangri-La, but when he arrives, it's been invaded by the Rakshasa, and his demon followers have chained down Shangri-La's sole source of power, these giant bells of enlightenment. And by doing that, he's twisting the land into a nightmarish sort of place. Our Kalanag arrived in Shangri-La out of obligation to his king, but he finds himself caught up in a struggle for its very existence. Kalanag joins the tiger, and together they fight to defeat this guy, and they're freeing the bells of enlightenment together. It sounds very familiar because it's a complete parallel to the main story. And now by creating Kalanag, it wasn't long till we realized that the tiger's place and meaning in the world was missing. And in search of an answer, the battle between having ally versus companion came up. And I think these next two picks kind of sum it up best. That's right. These are my cats, and this is definitely my favorite slide. Now, Cinder on the left, she's my companion. She'll follow me everywhere. She doesn't care about shit. She's very, very dumb. I'm serious, she's super dumb. And, she forgets to use her back legs sometimes, and will never make any kind of jump. But she's a sweetheart, and I love her. Yuki on the right, she will cut you. And seriously, she will cut you. She could have been an extra on The Wire. That's like what I like to tell people. She brings me plush koala bears as offerings from hunts she has in the apartment, and she would be a perfect ally in battle. This is a companion, and this is an ally. The tiger was neither to be friend nor foe. He wasn't going to be male or female, and this was not an arbitrary designation, I assure you. Just like in any main campaign, we needed to have our characters complement each other. Again, we were always looking for connections to the real world of Kharat in the main game. AJ and the player must choose between two Golden Path warriors, Amita and Sabal. And the success of their mission completely depends on that choice. And they in a sense, see themselves as protectors of Kharat. And pulling from that, we decided to make the tiger kind of the protector of Shangri-La. But how do we get this stuff across? Because practically speaking, we still sort of needed a voice. I knew we couldn't have a speaking player character, but nobody said we couldn't Morgan Freeman the thing. And if we couldn't have a game time Kalaneg, why not older Kalaneg dictating the story to a Tanka painter in Kharat? But we still weren't satisfied. We hadn't pushed our limits further enough. We didn't want Shangri-La to feel cheap, like a painter of missions from the main game. And one tool we had was authenticity. Have our narrator speak fluent Hindi and fluent Hindi only that required subtitles across all platforms, because making players read is definitely popular. But despite 1,000 complications, we made it happen, and our lack of player voice went from being a weakness to becoming a distinct characteristic of the sub-narrative. And if the players didn't read it, the truth is, I did not care, because Shangri-La was always to be experiential, and the Hindi just added to that. But a narrator having an authentic voice was not enough. This had to be a living, breathing world that the player could believe in. We still only had the bones of the sub-narrative, characters and plot, honestly. The gaps were missing. We needed to be authentic. Not to the rules of the real world or even Kharat, but we needed to be authentic to our own parallel universe. Shangri-La needed its own rules, its own history, its own heroes and villains. Simply put, it was not going to be true and honest and meaningful only if we put the effort into that. Now, I love that I'm speaking to writers, because you'll understand the need for story Bibles, whether you've heard of them or used them or ignored them. What we did slightly different here was we decided to create a Bible not for the whole game, but for just our parallel universe. We answered every possible question about Shangri-La in that thing, and honestly, 75% of the time, those answers might go unused by the rest of the team. But the point isn't about who uses it, though honestly, the more the merrier. This is Shauna. She is 3. She was asked by her teacher to write her mom a letter saying how she felt about her. I'm showing you this because when I write notes, that's what it looks like. People say it kind of looks like a doctor having a seizure. But why do I do it? I never look at my notebook after I've written something in it. Really rarely. But it helps me remember. It's the same with the narrative Bible. Going through that process of creating it helps you ingrain the story in your brain. And that is critical for your team. If it's in my brain, then when an artist comes to my desk and says, "Why is the sea in Shangri-La red?" Well, I will tell you. I can answer that Kyra, the daughter of the great creator god Banisher, had been given a human form by her father, and she was ordered to achieve enlightenment in the mountains of Kharat so she could join her ancestors in nirvana. Kyra meditated for years, focusing her mind by spinning prayer wheels and listening to the ringing of a small bell. One day, frustrated with her progress, Kyra spun her prayer wheel in anger as she pricked her finger. Her hand bleeding, she washed it in a river. She watched in horror as the entire river turned red, and then the grass, and then the trees. Banisher's punishment for her haste and impatience was that anything that fed off the water would be stained red permanently. Realizing her mistake, Kyra renewed her focus and finally achieved enlightenment. Her essence was soaked up by the earth. Her prayer wheels and bells became massive and infused with power, protecting the land with good and truth. The player will see none of that. They don't hear it, they don't watch it. We couldn't even afford to show it if we wanted to. But as developers, knowing the answers infuses the environment with truth, consistency, and authenticity. I find as developers, we sometimes fall in the trap of thinking we'll try and answer every question possible for the player without even answering those questions for ourselves. And players can tell the difference. Players can feel the thought and effort behind your world. Just like when you visit a Mayan temple, you might not know what any of the symbols mean, but you feel the weight of history that's going to bear down on you. With a parallel narrative, the experience of the story is paramount, meaning it can be felt, not told. In this instance, we pose questions to players so that they would have just as interesting answers. And in an odd way, meaningful subnarrative depends on the writer taking the stance mentally that it is its own main narrative. The critical difference being that the subnarrative has a responsibility to speak to the truth of the main narrative, speaking truth to power, to form a full picture of the story being told. And Shangri-La and the murder mysteries were successful because of a simple fact. We invested time, effort, and money into content that might not be seen. Shangri-La had 1 mission in the critical path, 4 that were completely optional. This image is of a frozen seeker, a seeker who, like Kalaneg, came before but never survived his mission. You can interact with him and others and receive more narration of the Shangri-La lore, but these are completely optional. ACU's murder mysteries, completely optional. You might not never see any of it, which makes it more powerful. Games lend themselves to subnarratives in a way that no other medium can, but with the focus on side missions or parallel worlds is often only there at the tail end of a project when you're basically out of time. And honestly, as a team, we avoided this. That mentality, that realization has served me well on the project I'm currently on, and I'm dying to tell you everything I can about it, but all I can say is that Echoes in the Division will be very, very cool. And I have to leave it at that. I'm sorry. To wrap, it may not seem as glamorous, but every story has a sub-narrative waiting politely to be told, and it does no harm to listen. If you look deep enough, in the end, the journey of Shangri-La ended up being one of AJ's past, his present, and his future. That would be discovery, acceptance of his journey, and ultimately an acceptance of an uncertain, unpainted future. It was an exact mirror of our production process. And I can say truthfully, it was an exact mirror of every play experience I've had. There's no question in my mind that sub-narratives right now are underutilized. This content really exists for a reason. And just by the fact it exists, it means we can push it to its limits and have parallel worlds that can live happily together. And let's see if this works. Thank you very much. And I want to say a huge, huge thank you to the Ubisoft Toronto art team. The art director, Josh Cook, is right there. Make sure you say hi to that guy because their work is amazing. But thank you so much. If you want to ask me questions, I'll be in the wrap-up thing. Yes. Thank you.